I refuse to accept this false identity. I have been searching the wrong villages for years.
She did not scream. That was the thing Oriana Voss would remember most clearly, years later, when the memory surfaced in the quiet hours before dawn. The way she had simply stood there in the doorway of the upstairs parlor, one hand still raised to knock, and felt the world rearrange itself around her without making a single sound. The fire had been low, the candles were nearly spent, and there, wrapped in the amber shadows of a room she had believed empty, was the man she was to marry in 17 hours and her sister, Helene, his hand in her hair, her sister's fingers pressed against the lapels of his coat. Raphael Ardennes, Duke of Velmore, did not see her at first. He was too absorbed in whatever quiet, terrible intimacy had drawn him to this room, to this woman who was not his betrothed. And Helene, beautiful, reckless Helene, saw her over his shoulder and did not pull away. She simply looked at Oriana with those wide, pale eyes and said nothing. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then Oriana stepped back, closed the parlor door with the quietest click she could manage, walked the length of the corridor, descended the great staircase of Velmore House, set her engagement ring on the silver tray beside the entrance, and walked out into the November dark without a coat, without a bag, without a single word to anyone. She did not scream. She did not break. She simply vanished. And for 5 years, the world assumed she had. The village of Casterfon sat on the edge of the Cornish coast, like something the sea had left behind, a cluster of whitewashed cottages, a harbor that smelled of salt and old rope, and a population that asked very few questions of the women who arrived alone and stayed. Oriana had found it by accident, or perhaps by instinct. She had walked until she couldn't walk anymore, and when the road curved toward the cliffs, and she heard the sound of the water below, she felt something in her chest go still. She had stopped running. She had stayed. 5 years had changed her in every visible way. The name she gave the village was Clara Voss, her mother's maiden name, stripped of the aristocratic weight that came with it. Her hair, once arranged and pinned and primped for drawing rooms, now hung loose in a thick plait down her back. She wore plain wool dresses and heavy boots, and spent her mornings at the small schoolhouse on the hill, teaching the fishermen's children to read. Her hands, which had once been kept soft for piano and embroidery, were chapped at the knuckles now. She was happier than she had ever been. She was also exhausted in a way that bone-deep love tends to make you, because she had not come to Casterfon entirely alone. The boys were 4 years old now, twin boys, born in the summer after her disappearance, in a small midwife's cottage outside Truro, with no one present but the woman who delivered them and the god who apparently had a very particular sense of irony. Jasper had arrived first, furious and red-faced, already announcing himself to a world that hadn't asked. Felix had come second, quieter, studying the ceiling of the cottage with the same grave expression he still wore now whenever something puzzled him. They had their mother's dark auburn hair. They had their father's eyes. Oriana had noticed this within the first days of their lives, and the ache of it had never fully left her. Those storm-gray eyes, watchful and deep, looking up at her from faces that were otherwise entirely hers. She loved them without condition or limit. She would have walked through fire for either of them. She would have stayed hidden from everything she had ever known for their sake. She had, in fact, done exactly that. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when things began to shift. Oriana was marking papers at the schoolhouse. Jasper had smudged ink across the margins of his arithmetic again. Felix had written a surprisingly precise essay about tides, when old Mrs. Trenwith appeared in the doorway, breathless in the way of women who have climbed the hill too quickly and have news that cannot wait. "There's a carriage coming through," the older woman announced. "Grand one, London plate." Oriana did not look up from the papers. Probably lost. Doesn't look lost. Mrs. Trenwith pressed closer. 2 men on horseback behind it, and the man inside, Clara, love, he had the look of someone who's been searching for something. Oriana's pen stopped. Very slowly she set it down. What did he look like? Mrs. Trenwith described a tall man, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in a coat that cost more than most Casterfon households earned in a year. He had asked, apparently, whether anyone knew of a woman named Oriana Voss. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the tide to turn. "Thank you," Oriana said, and her voice was perfectly steady. "Could you watch the boys this afternoon?" She had spent 5 years preparing for the possibility that he might find her. She had also spent 5 years telling herself he wouldn't bother. Raphael Ardennes had an estate worth £400,000, a seat in the House of Lords, and the kind of name that appeared in history books. He had, presumably, married Helene, or if not Helene, then some other suitable woman. He had, presumably, moved on with the efficient grace that powerful men use to absorb even their most catastrophic mistakes. He had not, apparently, done any of those things. She watched from the window of the schoolhouse as the carriage rolled to a stop in the village square below. The door opened. A man stepped out, and Oriana Voss, who had not cried on the night she left, who had given birth to twins without making a sound that would carry through the cottage walls, who had built an entire life in the silence of her own making, pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and felt her throat close. He was different, not in his height, or the set of his shoulders, or the particular way he stood, as though the ground beneath him existed to accommodate his posture. Those things were the same, but the easy authority that had once lived in his face, the careless confidence of a man who had never been denied anything, was gone. In its place was something harder and hollower. He looked like a man who had been searching for something for a very long time, and had grown quietly furious at himself for needing to look. He spoke to someone in the square, a fisherman by the look of it. The fisherman pointed up the hill, toward the schoolhouse. Oriana stepped back from the window. She had 3 minutes, perhaps 4. She used them to collect the boy's papers from the desk, stack them neatly, and sit down in the chair behind it, as though she had been sitting there all morning, and intended to remain sitting there indefinitely. She folded her hands. She breathed. She was Clara Voss. She taught children to read. She lived in the second cottage from the harbor. She had nothing to do with London or ducal estates, or the particular grey of storm cloud eyes that she had been failing to forget for 5 years. The knock at the schoolhouse door was firm, not aggressive, but not tentative either. The knock of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head, at least once. "Come in," she said. The door opened, and Raphael Arden walked into the schoolhouse of Castrofon with the same energy he had always brought into every room. That particular gravity, that quiet authority, except that today his face, when it found hers across the small classroom, did something she had not expected. It cracked, just for a moment, just a fraction. The controlled mask slipped, and underneath it she saw something raw and relieved and furious all at once. And then he brought it back and squared his jaw and said, in a voice that was very carefully steady, "Hello, Oriana." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have the wrong village," she said. "My name is Clara." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "I have the right village," he said. "I have been looking at the wrong villages for approximately 4.5 years. I am done making that particular mistake." He did not shout. She had expected shouting, had half prepared herself for it. The ducal authority deployed as a weapon, the accusations of what she had done by leaving, the indignation of a man whose life had been inconvenienced by her absence. What she had not prepared for was the quiet. He stood just inside the door. He did not advance. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been imagining for so long that the real thing seems impossible to believe. "You're well," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm well," she agreed. "You're thinner." "You came all the way to Cornwall to observe that?" Something flickered across his face. Something that was almost the beginning of a smile before it thought better of itself. "I came because I need to speak with you. We have nothing to speak about. We have a great deal to speak about." He paused, starting with why you left without a word. The boldness of it was breathtaking. She stared at him. "You know why I left." "I know what you saw," he said quietly. "And I know that what you saw was not what it appeared to be." The anger arrived then, clean and clarifying, cutting through the shock of his presence like salt water through fog. "I saw your hands in my sister's hair," she said, very evenly. "In the parlor of your own house, the night before our wedding. What, precisely, would you like to suggest?" He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, she thought she saw something that might have been shameful. "I want to explain." "I don't want your explanation." She rose from behind the desk. "I want you to leave. Oriana, I want you to leave this village and not come back. I have a life here, a good one. Whatever you've come to say or reclaim or demand, it doesn't exist anymore. We don't exist anymore. We ended up in that doorway 5 years ago. The words were true. She believed every one of them. And yet standing there in the small schoolhouse with the sound of the sea below and the autumn light coming in through the windows, she was acutely, painfully aware of exactly how tall he was, exactly how familiar the line of his jaw was, exactly how much effort it was costing her to maintain the 4 feet of distance between them. He did not leave. He stood exactly where he was and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, very quietly, Where are the children? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Oriana had ever heard. She had been so careful. 5 years of care. 5 years of different names and a village where no one asked, and a life that had no connection to the world she had left. She had told no one. Not the midwife in Truro, not entirely at least. Not Mrs. Trenwith, who minded the boys sometimes and asked no questions. Not the children's schoolmaster who had hired her as his assistant and then, when age softened his bones, handed her the entire operation. She had been so careful. "I don't know what you mean," she said. Raphael did not look away. "I know you have children," he said. His voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it. Something that was not accusation, not yet, but was the shape that accusation would take if she didn't speak. "I have been looking for you for years, Oriana. I have spoken to people. I know that you gave birth in the summer after you left. I know there were 2. He paused. "I know boys." Her hands had gone very still at her sides. "Mrs. Trenwith watches them this afternoon," he continued, and he said it gently, which was worse somehow than if he had said it like a threat. 2 boys, dark-haired, the age they would be if he stopped. He took a slow breath. "How old are they?" The longest pause of her life. 4, she said. He absorbed this. She watched it move through him, the arithmetic of it, the implication, the weight of 4 years settling across his shoulders like something he had been unconsciously carrying for a long time, and was only now being shown its name. "Are they mine?" She should have denied it. She had rehearsed the denial. She had a whole architecture of careful misdirection built for exactly this moment. A brief, invented love affair, a name she could produce if pressed, a timeline that could be made to look ambiguous if she angled it correctly. She looked at his face. She thought of Jasper's eyes. She thought of Felix watching the ceiling. "Yes," she said. The word fell between them like a stone into still water. Raphael Arden, Duke of Velmore, who had walked into the room composed and controlled and holding himself together by what was clearly considerable effort, went very, very still. His eyes closed for the length of 3 breaths. When he opened them, they were wet. Oriana looked away. She could not bear it. Not the grief in his face, not the complicated avalanche of feeling that was moving through her chest, not the horrible, tender fact that some part of her had wanted him to know for 4 years, and another part had been certain that keeping him away was the only thing standing between her boys and the world that had broken her. "I want to see them," he said. "I know. I need to see them, Oriana." "I know," she turned back to him. "But first you're going to tell me what happened in that parlor. All of it. Because whatever it is, whatever you've decided to tell yourself about what I saw, I deserve the truth before you meet my sons." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow and steady. "Yes," he said, "you do." They sat on opposite sides of the single table in the schoolhouse. Teacher's chair on one side, a child's chair on the other, which meant Raphael spent the entire conversation with his knees nearly level with the tabletop, a logistical indignity that he bore without comment. He told her the truth, or at least what she believed, by the end of it, was the truth. Helene had come to him that night, not for the reason it appeared. She had come in a panic, his words, because she had discovered something she believed Oriana needed to know, and had been terrified of saying it directly. Something about their father. A debt, a transaction, a piece of the marriage arrangement that had been made without Oriana's knowledge. Helene, who had always been the chaos to Oriana's order, had apparently spent 3 days working up the courage to speak, and had chosen the worst possible moment and the worst possible manner. Dramatic, tearful, reaching for his lapels as she always did when she was frightened, because she was the sort of woman who reached for the nearest person when she was frightened. It was Helene. It had always been Helene. The hand in her hair had been him comforting her. Poorly, Oriana admitted privately. Inappropriately. In a way that, from a doorway at midnight, looked like something it entirely was not. "You didn't come after me," Oriana said. "I didn't know you'd seen us until morning. I thought you'd simply had cold feet." His voice was flat with old shame. "By the time I understood you were gone, I spent 3 days waiting, then a week, then I started looking." 3 days, she said. "I know. You let 3 days pass. I know." He looked down at the table. "I believed my own pride over my instincts. I told myself you would come back when you were ready, that you would send a word." He shook his head. "By the time I understood that you weren't coming back, you had covered your trail very effectively. You always were intelligent. I had motivation. Yes." Something moved through his face. "I imagine you did." She studied him across the small table. 5 years of absence. 5 years of silence. She had built a life on the ruins of a single misread moment, and so, she realized with a slow, complicated ache, had he. She thought of the hollowness she had seen in his face when he stepped out of the carriage. The man who had been searching for a long time and had grown furious at himself for needing to look. "Helene," she said. "Did you?" "No." His answer came immediately, without hesitation. "I ended the engagement the moment you were gone. There has been no one." He held her gaze. "There has been no one, Oriana. Not in 5 years." She did not know what to do with that, so she folded it away, somewhere careful, and looked out at the sea. She brought him to Mrs. Trenwith's cottage as the light was going golden and low, the way it did in October on the Cornish coast. Everything warm and sideways, the sea catching fire at the horizon. He walked beside her without speaking. She could feel the tension in him, the barely contained something that had been building since she said the word yes. Mrs. Trenwith opened the door, saw the large, expensive stranger behind Oriana, and had the particular grace of a Cornish woman who had lived long enough to know when a thing was complicated and not to make it more so. "They're in the kitchen," she said. "The quiet one has been drawing. The loud one has been trying to get into my jam." Oriana almost smiled. "That sounds right." She stepped inside. Raphael followed. The kitchen was warm, smelling of bread and beeswax. Felix was at the table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, drawing something with the focused intensity that was entirely his own. Jasper was on the stool by the larder, caught mid-reach, who froze when the adults entered and attempted the expression of a child who has not been doing anything. "Jasper," Oriana said. "I wasn't," he began. "You absolutely were." She crossed the room and kissed the top of his head. "Come sit down." She heard, rather than saw, the moment Raphael saw them properly. A small sound, almost nothing. The kind of sound a person makes when something strikes the part of them that was not ready to be struck. She turned. He was standing just inside the kitchen doorway. Both boys had looked up now. Felix with his customary careful attention, studying the tall stranger with the pencil still in his hand. Jasper with his mouth slightly open, the jam transgression entirely forgotten. The gray eyes. Both of them. That exact color, that exact quality of stillness, looking at their father for the first time with their father's own expression of measured appraisal, and having no idea what they were doing. Raphael Ardennes looked at his sons. His jaw moved. Nothing came out. Felix, because he was Felix, and had apparently inherited her tendency to fill silence with something practical, said, "Who are you?" Oriana watched him kneel. He went down to one knee on the kitchen flagstones, this powerful, formidable man. This duke who had an estate and a title, and the kind of name that made people straighten their spines when they said it, and brought himself to the eye level of a 4-year-old boy and said, very quietly, "My name is Raphael. I'm a friend of your mother's." Felix considered him the way Felix considered everything, thoroughly, with full attention, without hurry. "You have the same eyes as me and Jasper," he observed. Raphael's breath stuttered. "I know. Mama says our eyes are special." "They are," Raphael said. "She's right." Jasper, who operated on instinct where his brother operated on analysis, had already slid off the stool and was standing close enough to touch, studying the Duke with unabashed curiosity. "Are you very rich?" he asked. "Jasper," Oriana started. "It's all right." Raphael's voice had gone rough at the edges. He looked at Jasper. "Yes, I am. Why?" Jasper considered. "You have a big coat." "I do." "Felix says big coats are for important people, or cold people. A pause. Which one are you?" And then something happened that Oriana had not expected, and could not have prepared herself for. Raphael Ardennes laughed. Not the polished social laugh of a duke at a dinner party. A real one startled out of him, rough and genuine and entirely unguarded, and he pressed one hand to the kitchen floor to steady himself as it moved through him, and both boys stared at him with delighted surprise, and Mrs. Trenwith, in the doorway behind Oriana, made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. Oriana stood very still in the middle of the kitchen, and felt something in her chest shift. Some careful structure she had been maintaining for 5 years, built from pain and pride, and the quiet daily work of survival, shift, just slightly, on its foundations. She did not let it fall, but she felt it move. He stayed until dark. She had not planned for that. She had imagined the meeting going one of 2 ways. Either he would see the boys and be satisfied and leave, or he would see the boys and demand something she couldn't give, and they would argue. What she had not imagined was this third possibility. Jasper climbing uninvited into his lap 15 minutes after meeting him. Felix showed him the drawing, which turned out to be a reasonably accurate sketch of the harbor. Raphael sat on Mrs. Trenwith's kitchen floor with a child on each knee, answering a series of questions about his horse, his house, and whether he had ever seen a whale. When she finally walked them home and put them to bed, Jasper falling asleep, mid-sentence, Felix reading until she took the candle, she came back downstairs to find Raphael standing outside the cottage door, looking out at the dark sea. She stood beside him. They were quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to take them from you," he said, "if that's what you're afraid of. That's not the only thing I'm afraid of." He turned his head to look at her. In the dark, with the sea wind pulling at his coat and his face stripped of the careful ducal composure he usually wore, he looked more like the man she had once agreed to marry than the stranger who had walked into the schoolhouse. It was, she thought, distinctly unfair. "I know I have no right to ask for anything," he said. "Not after 5 years, not after—" He stopped, began again. "But I need you to understand that I am not leaving Casterphon. Not this time. I am done leaving. I left too much unresolved 5 years ago, when I waited 3 days instead of following you immediately, and I have paid for that every day since." His voice was very quiet and very certain. "I will stay in the village inn until you are ready to speak with me further. I will not pressure you or the boys, but I am not disappearing again." She looked at him for a long moment. "The inn charges 3 shillings a night," she said, "and Mrs. Palmyre waters the ale." He held her gaze. "I've stayed in worse places while looking for you." She turned away before whatever was rising in her expression could reach her face. "Good night, Raphael. Good night," he said. "Oriana." She went inside. She latched the door. She stood in the dark entrance hall of her small, honest, carefully built life and pressed both hands against the wood of the door and breathed. Outside, she heard him walk away. Slow footsteps on the cobblestones heading toward the harbor lights. He had not pushed. He had not demanded. He had sat on a kitchen floor with his sons. God, she still couldn't entirely hold that fact, and he had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time. She was not going to let herself feel this, not yet. Not until she knew what it meant and what it cost and whether the thing she had been protecting her children from had truly changed, or whether she was about to make the same mistake twice because a man had storm-gray eyes and a genuine laugh, and he had come all the way to Cornwall. But her hands were still pressed against the door, and she did not move for a very long time. The morning after Raphael arrived in Casterphon, the village talked about nothing else. This was, Oriana supposed, inevitable. Casterphon was the kind of place where a new fishing net warranted discussion over 3 consecutive breakfasts. A London carriage with ducal insignia on the door, accompanied by 2 outriders and a man whose coat alone cost more than the harbor master's annual wage, was essentially a social event of historic proportions. By the time she walked the boys to Mrs. Trenwith's and arrived at the schoolhouse, she had received 4 separate accounts of the stranger's appearance, 2 unsolicited opinions about his likely intentions, and 1 firmly delivered warning from old Captain Pello that grand London men always brought trouble to small coastal villages, and she ought to send him back where he came from. She thanked everyone politely and said nothing. At mid-morning, a knock came at the schoolhouse door. She knew without opening it that it would be him. It was. He was carrying 2 cups of tea from the harbor bakehouse, and wearing the expression of a man who has spent a night in a questionable inn and has decided to say nothing about it. "Mrs. Palmyre does indeed water the ale," he said. "The tea, however, is excellent." She stepped aside to let him in. He set 1 cup on her desk and took his position by the window, not sitting, just standing, looking out at the sea, and she recognized it as something she did herself when she needed to think without the room pressing in. "You should know," she said, settling into her chair, "that staying in this village will cause talk. My life here depends on a certain quiet, on people not asking questions. I understand that." He turned from the window. "I've asked my men to be discreet. The carriage will be stabled outside the village." A pause. "I'm aware that I cannot undo 5 years of careful living in the morning." "No," she agreed. "You can't." He sat down in the chair across from her, the adult chair this time which she had relocated from the corner, and looked at her in that direct, unhurried way he had always had. She had forgotten this about him, or had tried to, that he never looked away from a difficult thing. Most men of his position had perfected the art of looking slightly past the point of discomfort. Raphael looked directly at it. "Tell me about them," he said. "Tell me who they are." So she did. She told him about Felix, who had been born with his eyes already focused, who had taken to reading at 3 and now consumed every book she brought him with a thoroughness that was slightly alarming. Who drew everything: the harbor, the cliffs, the schoolhouse cat. with more accuracy than most adults managed, who spoke carefully and rarely, but when he did speak, tended to produce observations that stopped a room. She told him about Jasper, who had arrived in the world loudly and had continued in that vein without apparent interruption, who made friends with everyone, from the harbor fisherman to the baker's dog, to a particularly questionable seagull that had taken to sitting on the schoolhouse windowsill because Jasper had once given it half a bun, who fell down constantly and cried rarely, and was, she said, the most relentlessly cheerful person she had ever met, which was baffling given the circumstances of his conception. Raphael's mouth curved at that. Not quite a smile. Something quieter. "He's like you," she said, meaning Jasper, before she could stop herself. She saw him absorb it, the compliment she hadn't meant to give, the intimacy of the observation, the fact that she had been watching him closely enough over 4 years to know. "And Felix?" he asked. She considered it. "Felix is like no one I've ever met," she said honestly. "He simply is himself, fully and already." Raphael was quiet for a moment. "I would like to know them," he said, "properly. Not as the large stranger who sat on Mrs. Trenwith's kitchen floor, as their father." He held her gaze. "I am asking your permission to begin, slowly, at whatever pace you set." It was, she thought, the right thing to say. She was not naive enough to believe that made it simple. "And what happens when the season ends and you're required back in London?" she asked. "What happens when Parliament sits and the estate demands you and the 100 obligations of a duke recall you to your life? What do I tell 2 4-year-old boys when the large, interesting stranger stops appearing?" "I'm not asking for a season," he said quietly. "I'm asking for a life." The words landed with a weight she wasn't ready for. She looked down at her desk. "Raphael, I'm not asking for an answer today," he said. "I'm asking you to understand what I mean when I say I'm not leaving. This is not a visit. I will arrange the estate to be managed in my absence for as long as it takes." He paused. "I have not been living, Oriana. Not properly. Not since you left. I have been administering, managing, attending the obligations of my position without any of the substance that makes a life worth administering." Something raw moved through his voice. "I want my sons. And I want the chance to prove to you that what you saw 5 years ago was not what it appeared to be, and that the man sitting in front of you now has earned the right to ask." She pressed her hands flat against the desk. "Don't," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "Don't do that yet. Don't ask me to feel something I haven't decided to feel yet. Let me trust you first. Let me trust the situation. Then we can talk about the rest." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "All right." 2 weeks passed. They were, in their quiet and complicated way, the strangest 2 weeks of Oriana's life, which was a remarkable thing to say, given that the competition included giving birth alone in a Cornish midwife's cottage. Raphael stayed. True to his word, he arranged himself unobtrusively into the fabric of Castrofon, or as unobtrusively as a duke could manage, which was to say that he was still objectively the most distinctive person in the village, but he had stopped wearing the expensive coat. He appeared at the harbor in the mornings, talking to the fishermen with the specific directness of a man who was used to managing large operations and found practical problems genuinely interesting. He helped repair a section of the harbor wall on a Wednesday afternoon, which became, within 24 hours, the most discussed event in the village's recent memory. Captain Pello, who had delivered the warning about Grand London men, revised his opinion. "He works," the captain told Oriana, "with the particular approval of a man who has spent 60 years sorting the world into those who did and those who didn't. Can't say it's worse than that. With the boys he was careful and patient and, she was forced to admit, remarkably natural. He did not try too hard. He did not overload them with attention or gifts or the particular desperate enthusiasm of a parent trying to compress years of absence into a fortnight. He simply showed up consistently, at a pace they could absorb. He learned that Felix responded to questions better than declarations, that Jasper needed to be in motion to be at ease. Conversations on walks worked better than conversations at tables, that both boys were more themselves when they were outside, near the sea. He learned their rhythms, and he adjusted to them. She watched this and felt it doing things to her carefully maintained composure that she was not entirely prepared for. On a Sunday afternoon, she came to collect the boys from the harbor where Raphael had taken them to watch the fishing boats come in, and found Felix sitting on a capstan with his sketchbook, drawing the boats, and Jasper perched on Raphael's shoulders, narrating a seagull dispute with tremendous authority, while Raphael stood at the water's edge with the patience of a man who had found exactly where he wanted to be and intended to stay there. She stopped on the harbor path and watched them. No one saw her. She let herself watch for 30 seconds longer than was sensible, and then she made herself walk forward. The threat arrived on a Thursday. It came in the form of a letter, delivered to the village inn at dawn by a private courier who had ridden through the night. Raphael brought it to her at the schoolhouse before the children arrived, and she could tell from the set of his jaw that something had shifted. He set the letter on her desk without speaking. She read it. The letter was from a man named Lord Aldrich Vane, the Earl of Sternmore, the Duke's second cousin and, in the absence of legitimate heirs, the current heir presumptive to the Velmore title and fortune. It was 3 paragraphs of elaborate, poisonous courtesy. The first paragraph expressed Vane's surprise at learning the Duke had located his missing former betrothed in a Cornish fishing village. The second paragraph expressed his concern that rumors of children, illegitimate children, the letter took care to stress, born outside any marriage, to a woman who had abandoned her engagement and disappeared from society, might complicate the succession in ways that would be legally contested. The third paragraph was the one that made Oriana's hands go cold. It expressed Vane's intention, should the Duke attempt to legitimize any such children, to bring before the court of public opinion, and if necessary the courts of law, certain information regarding the character and behavior of the woman in question. Specifically, certain evidence suggesting that the children's paternity was not, in fact, as clear as the Duke might wish to believe. Evidence that could be produced at Vane's discretion. It was fabricated. She knew it was fabricated. But fabrication, in the world she had grown up in and half escaped, didn't need to be true. It needed only to be said loudly enough, and in the right rooms. She set the letter down. "He's bluffing," she said. "Possibly." Raphael's voice was flat. "Vane has spent 5 years anticipating the title. I am an inconvenience. My sons are a catastrophe." He was watching her face. "I need you to know that I do not believe a word of what he implies. Not for a single moment." "I know," she said, because she did. She could see it in the way he was standing, the controlled fury of a man whose children had just been used as leverage. "He will make things difficult," Raphael said. "If I bring you and the boys back to Velmore, if I claim them publicly, give them my name, Vane will fight it. He has allies. He has the money to sustain a legal campaign for years." He paused. "I want you to understand what that means before I ask anything of you." She was quiet for a moment. "What does it mean?" "It means that if you agree to marry me," he said very steadily, "you will be walking into a war. Your name, your past, your disappearance, all of it will be examined publicly. Vane will make it as unpleasant as possible." He looked at her directly. "And the boys will eventually be old enough to understand what is being said about their mother." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the village beginning its morning, the harbor, the bakehouse. Somewhere down the hill, Jasper's laugh. He and Felix were with Mrs. Trenwith until school began, and apparently he had discovered something delightful. She thought about her sons growing up in Castafon, safe, quiet, loved, small. Jasper climbing capstans and befriending seagulls. Felix drew the harbor with his careful, precise hand. 2 boys who did not know their father's name, who had no claim to the world that was theirs by blood, who would grow up in the shadow of an absence she had manufactured. She thought about them growing up knowing their father had come for them, knowing he had stayed. "What is the alternative?" she asked. "I can continue to fight Vane from a distance," Raphael said. "I can support you and the boys privately, financially. No public claim, no marriage." His voice was very careful. "It would be safer for you, and for you. It would not be what I want." His eyes held hers. "But I will do it, if that is what you choose. Your safety and theirs comes before what I want. It has come before what I want for 5 years, whether you knew it or not." She looked at him for a long moment. "You said there has been no one," she said. "In 5 years. No one." "Why?" The question was quiet, but it had weight. She watched him receive it. "Because I knew," he said simply. "The moment I understood what I had lost. Not a betrothed, not a suitable match, but you, specifically, the particular person that you are. I knew that looking for something else would be a kind of lie I wasn't willing to tell." He paused. "I also knew I didn't deserve anything else. Not until I found you and said what needed to be said." She looked away, at the window, at the sea. "He'll come here," she said. "Vane, if he knows where we are. He already knows where we are. The courier found me, which means Vane has people watching." She turned back. "Then we don't have the luxury of deciding slowly." "No," he agreed. She thought of the boys on the harbor wall. She thought of Felix's eyes. She thought of the way Raphael had laughed in Mrs. Trenwith's kitchen. That real, unguarded laugh. And how it had sounded like a man remembering that he was capable of it. She thought about what it meant to be brave versus what it meant to simply be tired of hiding. "I need 3 days," she said. He nodded immediately. No pressure, no urgency. Just, yes. "And I need you to understand that if I agree, if we do this, it is not because of Vane or the title or any legal necessity. It is because I have chosen it, freely, the way I should have been able to choose things from the beginning." "Understood," he said. "And if, at any point, I decide that what you are telling me about that night is not the complete truth, it is the complete truth, then everything stops. The boys are mine first, Raphael. Before the title, before the succession, before any of it. They are yours first," he said. "They have always been yours first. I am asking to be second, not instead." She pressed her lips together. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had sat on the kitchen floor and laughed for the first time in years. The man who had repaired harbor walls and learned her son's rhythms and stood at the water's edge with a small boy on his shoulders, as if that was the only place in the world he had ever wanted to stand. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he agreed. Vane arrived on the second day. He came without announcement, which was itself a kind of statement. A man who knew he was not welcome, and had decided that the welcome was irrelevant. Oriana saw the carriage from the schoolhouse window and felt something go cold and alert inside her. Not fear exactly. Something harder. She had the children sent to Mrs. Trenwith. Then she sent a boy to the inn with a single word on a folded piece of paper. Now. Vane was waiting at her cottage door when she arrived home. He was perhaps 50, lean-faced, with the particular expression of a man who had been anticipating something for a long time and was deciding how to enjoy it. "Lady Oriana," he said, with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "How delightfully rustic. Lord Vane." She unlocked the cottage door without looking at him. "Come in." He stepped inside, looked around at the small, clean rooms, the books on the shelves, the children's drawings pinned above the fireplace, the 2 small pairs of boots by the door, and his expression shifted to something she recognized as calculated pity. "You've made quite a life here," he said. "I have," she agreed. She did not offer him a chair. "A shame it cannot continue." He turned to face her. "You understand my position. The Velmore succession is a legal matter of considerable significance. Whatever sentimental attachment my cousin has formed to your situation, the practical reality is that a legitimacy challenge would take years. Years during which your children would be examined, questioned, and discussed in every court and drawing room in England." He paused. "I'm sure you've considered what that would mean for them." "I've considered it," she said evenly. "Then you understand that the kindest thing, the most sensible thing, would be to release my cousin from whatever renewed attachment he believes he has formed, take the very generous private settlement I am prepared to offer, and allow the matter of the succession to proceed as it was always intended to proceed." He smiled again. "The boys would be provided for, of course, anonymously, discreetly. No one needs to know anything." The silence that followed was very complete. Then the cottage door opened, and Raphael walked in. He took in the scene in a single glance. Vane near the fireplace, Oriana standing between them. The specific quality of stillness in her posture that he had learned over the past 2 weeks meant she was furious and managing it. Something moved across his face, briefly, and then he was entirely controlled again. "Aldrich," he said. Vane turned. If he was surprised, he hid it. "Cousin, I was just explaining the situation to Lady Oriana." "I heard." Raphael's voice was very quiet. He stepped fully into the room and closed the door. "I heard from the path." Vane's expression adjusted. "Then you understand, I understand that you have come to this woman's home and propose that she accept money in exchange for the anonymity of her children. My children." The quiet in his voice was the particular quiet of a man who is not raising it because he does not need to. "I want to be very clear about what happens next." Vane lifted his chin. "The legal precedent—" "I have had 4 conversations with my solicitors in the past 48 hours, Raphael said. "I have documentation of the boys' births, testimony from the attending midwife, and a medical record establishing a timeline that makes your implication about paternity not merely false but demonstrably, legally, actionable." He took 1 step forward. "I have also initiated a review of the Velmore entailment documents from 1847, which my grandfather's solicitor has confirmed contain a provision, allowing for the legitimization of children born to a woman the Duke subsequently marries. A provision," he added, that your own legal team appears to have overlooked. Vane had gone very still. You cannot simply, I intend to marry Oriana, Raphael said. I intend to give my sons my name. I intend to do this publicly, legally, and without apology. His eyes were absolutely steady. And if you choose to mount a campaign of slander against my wife and children, I will make it the most expensive decision of your life. The word wife landed in the room. Oriana felt it. Vane looked between them. Something in his expression shifted. Not defeat, not yet, but the recalculation of a man who had arrived expecting a manageable situation and found something else. You would spend years fighting this, he said. Yes, Raphael agreed. I would spend every year I have left fighting this. The question you should be asking yourself is whether you want to be the obstacle I am fighting. He paused. I suggest, Aldrich, that you go home, and I suggest that the next communication between us comes through solicitors. The silence stretched. Then Vane moved toward the door. He paused beside Oriana. You are making a mistake, he said, quietly enough that it was meant for her alone. I've made one before, she said. Leaving was mine. Staying this time is my choice. She met his gaze. I am not afraid of you. He left. The door closed. The cottage was very quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the sea did what the sea always did. Oriana turned slowly. Raphael was watching her. He had not moved from his position in the center of the room, and some of the controlled tension had gone out of him now that Vane was gone. She could see it leaving him, the deliberate calm unraveling slightly at the edges, and underneath it the same rawness she had seen when he walked into the schoolhouse. You said wife, she said. I know. You said it before I'd given you an answer. I know. Something moved through his expression. I should have waited. I'm sorry, but he stopped, pressed his mouth together. He was in your house, talking to you as though you were a problem to be managed, as though the boys were. His jaw tightened. I found it difficult to be precise about tense. She looked at him for a long moment. Raphael? Yes. The 3 days aren't finished. No, he agreed. But I've decided. He went very still. She crossed the room toward him. Not quickly. She had never done anything in her life quickly when it mattered, not when it was real, but steadily, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has thought clearly about something and is now choosing it with her whole self. She stopped in front of him. I want you to understand something, she said quietly. I am not doing this because of Vane or the title or the succession. I am not doing this because I am afraid of what happens if I don't. I know, he said. His voice was very low. I am doing this because my sons deserve to know who they are, and because you have sat on kitchen floors and repaired harbor walls and learned how to talk to a 4-year-old about seagulls, and because I have watched you do those things, and I know they are not performance. She held his gaze. And because I am tired of building my life in the shadow of a mistake that was not mine to carry. He was utterly still. And because, she said, quieter still, I never stopped. I tried. I was quite determined about it, but I never stopped. Raphael reached up slowly and took her face in both hands. The way a man holds something he is terrified of losing a second time. Not tightly, not possessively, but with a care so complete it was its own kind of gravity. I will not waste this, he said. It was not a declaration. It was a vow, private and total. No, she agreed. You won't. He kissed her. Gently at first, the question of it, the permission of it, and when she answered, it became something else. Something 5 years in the making, quiet and real and devastatingly unhurried, the way things are when both people know exactly what they almost lost. Outside, the October sea caught the last of the afternoon light and scattered it across the water in long golden lines. They were married 6 weeks later. Not in London. She had been clear about that, and he had agreed without hesitation. The ceremony was held in the small parish church of St. Petrox in the village above Casterphon, on a morning when the sky was the particular shade of pale November silver that made the coast look like a painting of itself. The witnesses were Mrs. Trenwith, who wept without apology. Captain Pello, who did not weep but gripped both their hands so firmly afterward that it amounted to the same thing. Raphael's solicitor, who was there in an official capacity and maintained strict professionalism right up until Felix solemnly presented him with a drawing of the harbor as a gift, at which point his composure became visibly uncertain. The boys wore their best clothes, which in Jasper's case lasted approximately 11 minutes before acquiring a streak of mud of unclear origin. Felix had asked, the evening before, whether the marriage meant they would have to leave Casterphon. Oriana had looked at Raphael. We will split our time, Raphael said. Velmore in the summer, Casterphon when we choose. Your mother decides where home is. Felix had considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. Then, can the seagull come? The seagull, Raphael said carefully, lives outside. That will not change. Felix had accepted this as satisfactory. Jasper, who had asked no preparatory questions because he processed events by living through them rather than anticipating them, stood beside his brother in the small church and watched his parents exchange vows with the expression of a child who is seeing something important happen and is storing it somewhere deep. When the ceremony was concluded and Raphael kissed Oriana and the small congregation applauded, Jasper put his hand in his father's with the completeness of a boy who had decided, some weeks ago, to do exactly this and had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment. Raphael looked down at him. Something moved across his face, grief and joy, and 4 years of absence pressing against the present moment from the inside. He held on. That evening, when the boys were asleep and the cottage was quiet, and the sea was doing its endless faithful work beyond the window, Oriana sat beside Raphael in the small sitting room with a cup of tea growing cold on the table, and said, without looking at him, "I want you to know something. Tell me. I was not unhappy here." She was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know that. The life I built, it was real. It was mine. I am not replacing it with this. I am adding to it." He turned his head to look at her. "I know," he said. "I could see it in every part of this place, how it fits you. I did not survive the last 5 years," she said. "I lived with them. There is a difference." She paused. "I need you to understand that about me before we build anything together. I am not a woman who was waiting to be rescued. I am a woman who built something worth having and then decided to invite you into it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not urgently, just held it, the way people hold things that belong to them, and always did. "I know," he said again. "That's why I came to Casterphon instead of sending a letter." She looked at him. "You needed to see me decide," she said slowly. "I needed you to see yourself decide," he said. "I would not have had it any other way." The fire settled. The sea breathed. Upstairs, Jasper was probably not yet asleep and was almost certainly plotting something involving the remaining jam. Oriana leaned her head against Raphael's shoulder. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the quiet of the cottage by the sea, and outside the November world was cold and dark and entirely indifferent, and inside everything was warm and honest and chosen. Vane mounted his legal challenge in the spring, as Raphael had predicted. He lost, as Raphael had also predicted, more swiftly than even the solicitors had expected, partly due to the 1847 provision, and partly due to the fact that Vane's claimed evidence of uncertain paternity, dissolved entirely under examination, revealed to be nothing more than a servant's rumor he had paid to have formalized. The judge was not amused. The costs awarded against Vane were considerable. Felix, who was 5 by then and had been told in age-appropriate terms that some people were trying to say he and Jasper were not who they were, thought about this for 3 days before announcing that those people were incorrect and that he had documentation. He had, in fact, drawn a detailed family portrait and labeled everyone with their correct names and relationships, which he presented to Raphael with the air of a barrister submitting evidence. Raphael kept it framed on his desk at Velmore for the rest of his life. Jasper's response to the legal challenge had been simpler. He had climbed into his father's lap during the period of uncertainty and gone to sleep, and Raphael had sat very still for a long time so as not to wake him, and Oriana, watching from the doorway, thought that this was perhaps the most complete sentence she had ever seen. They divided their year between Velmore and Casterphon, as promised. Velmore in the seasons of obligation, parliamentary duties, estate management, the social requirements of a ducal household. Casterphon when they needed the particular medicine of the sea and the small, honest life of the village. The schoolhouse passed to a young teacher from Truro, which Oriana supervised personally and visited often. Mrs. Trenwith came to Velmore for Christmas every year until she was too old to travel, at which point Oriana went to Casterphon for Christmas instead and brought the boys, and they ate bread from the harbor bakehouse and watched the winter sea from the cliff path and Jasper's seagull, or one very similar to it, appeared every year without fail, which Jasper took as proof of loyalty and Felix took as proof of territorial habit, and neither of them were entirely wrong. Years later, when the boys were grown and the story of their birth had become the kind of family legend that gets told at dinner tables to grandchildren, Felix would say that he remembered the day his father walked into the Casterphon schoolhouse. He remembered a very tall man who had their eyes. He remembered that the man knelt down to speak to him, which most adults did not bother to do. He remembered asking his name, and the man saying it, Raphael, like it was a complicated thing to say at that moment, like it cost something. He remembered showing the man his drawing of the harbor. He remembered that the man had looked at it for a long time, longer than most people, who tended to give drawings a polite 3 seconds, and then said, very quietly, "You see things clearly." It was, Felix would say, the truest thing anyone had ever said to him, and he had known, from that moment, that the man meant to stay. Jasper, asked the same question about his earliest memory of their father, would say, the laugh, the real one, in Mrs. Trenwith's kitchen, the one that had startled out of him, the one that sounded like a man who had forgotten he could. That was the one I trusted, Jasper would say. Everything else you can rehearse. You can't rehearse that. And Oriana, who had pressed her hands against a cottage door and stood in the dark for a very long time, who had built a life from silence and salt and the daily love of 2 gray-eyed boys, would hear this and look at the man she had chosen, finally, fully, with her whole self, and know that her son was right. Some things cannot be rehearsed. Some things arrive unguarded, in kitchen light, on a Tuesday afternoon, when a man kneels on flagstone and says his own name, like it is the most complicated thing in the world. Those are the things worth keeping. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself holding your breath in that cottage doorway, or smiling in Mrs. Trenwith's kitchen, or feeling something shift in your chest when Raphael held on, then this story did exactly what it was made to do. Love that is worth having is rarely uncomplicated. It is found, lost, searched for, and chosen again on purpose. What Oriana and Raphael discovered is what the wisest among us already know, that the bravest thing is not leaving, and it is not staying. It is deciding, with clear eyes, which one is true. If this moved you, share it with someone who loves a story about second chances and quiet courage. Leave a comment telling us which moment stayed with you. Was it the kitchen floor, the harbor wall, or the seagull? We genuinely want to know. Subscribe to the Duke Royal Tales, because every week there is another story waiting. Another Duke who must choose. Another woman who already has. Another love built in the most unexpected place. We'll see you in the next one.